The days following the funeral passed in a blur of private meetings and careful conversations, each interaction measured and guarded in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Harry found himself moving through his childhood home like a stranger, recognized but no longer quite belonging. The palace staff remained professional and courteous, but there was an invisible barrier now, a sense that his decision to step away from royal duties had fundamentally changed how he fit into this world. Harry had planned to stay in England for only a few days, just long enough to attend the funeral and handle any immediate family business. But as the reality of his grandfather's death settled in, he found himself reluctant to leave. This felt like the end of something important, not just Philip's life, but perhaps his own connection to the family and institution that had defined his identity for over 30 years. On his third day back, Harry received a message from his grandmother requesting a private audience. The Queen had been remarkably composed throughout the funeral proceedings, displaying the stoic dignity that had characterized her response to crisis throughout her long reign. But Harry knew that behind that public facade, she was grieving the loss of her husband of 73 years, her partner in the impossible task of modern monarchy. The meeting took place in the Queen's private sitting room at Windsor Castle, the same room where Harry had shared countless informal moments with his grandparents over the years. The space was filled with family photographs, personal mementos, and the comfortable furniture that spoke of decades of shared life. But now Philip's chair sat empty, a stark reminder of the absence that would define the rest of the Queen's life. Elizabeth looked smaller than Harry remembered, older in a way that had little to do with her advanced age. The death of her husband had clearly taken a toll, stripping away some of the vitality that had sustained her through decades of public service. But her eyes were still sharp, still possessed of the intelligence and perception that had made her one of the most respected monarchs in British history. "I wanted to see you alone," she said simply, gesturing for Harry to take a seat across from her. "We need to talk about your grandfather, about what his death means for all of us." Her voice was steady, but Harry could hear the grief beneath the surface, the pain of a woman who had lost not just her husband but her closest advisor and companion. They spoke first about Philip himself, sharing memories and stories that helped ease the immediate sharp edge of loss. The Queen told Harry about his grandfather's final weeks, about how he had spoken often of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, expressing pride in their accomplishments and concern for their futures. She shared details that the public would never know, intimate moments that revealed the private man behind the public figure. "He was proud of your military service," she said, looking directly at Harry. "He understood what that meant, what you sacrificed, and what you gained. He saw it as the best of what our family could offer, service that mattered beyond the ceremonies and pageantry." The words meant more to Harry than he could express, validation from his grandfather delivered through the person who had known Philip better than anyone else. But the conversation inevitably turned to more difficult territory. The Queen spoke carefully about the challenges facing the family, about the need for unity in the face of public scrutiny and changing times. She did not criticize Harry's decision to leave royal life, but she made it clear that she felt the family was stronger when they stood together, when they presented a united front to the world. "Your grandfather believed in duty above all else," she continued. "Not duty for its own sake, but duty as a form of service, a way of using privilege and position to benefit others. He struggled to understand your decision because he could not see how leaving would allow you to serve more effectively than staying." The words were gentle but pointed, a reminder of the values that had guided Philip throughout his life. Harry tried to explain his perspective, the pressures that had driven him and Meghan away, the sense that they could not be effective or authentic within the constraints of royal life. The Queen listened without judgment, but Harry could see that she was struggling to understand how the institution she had devoted her life to could have failed so completely to support one of her grandsons. "Change is hard," she said finally. "The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Perhaps we have not adapted quickly enough to meet the needs of your generation." It was as close to an admission of institutional failure as Harry had ever heard from his grandmother, a recognition that the family had somehow failed to evolve with the times. They talked for over an hour, the longest private conversation Harry had had with the Queen in years. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a recognition that despite their disagreements, the bonds of family remained strong. The Queen made it clear that Harry would always be welcome, that there would always be a place for him within the family, even if his role had necessarily changed. As the meeting concluded, the Queen handed Harry a small leather journal. "This was your grandfather's," she said. "He kept notes about family events, thoughts about the future, observations about all of you. I thought you might like to have it." The gift was unexpected and deeply meaningful, a tangible connection to Philip's thoughts and feelings about his family. That evening, alone in Frogmore Cottage, Harry opened the journal and began to read. Philip's handwriting was familiar from years of receiving birthday cards and letters, but seeing his private thoughts laid out on the page was deeply moving. The entries spanned several years and covered everything from state occasions to family gatherings, from observations about political developments to personal reflections on his grandchildren. One entry, dated just 6 months earlier, caught Harry's attention. Philip had written about watching the Oprah interview, about his struggle to understand Harry's public criticism of the family. But, rather than anger or disappointment, the entry revealed confusion and hurt, a grandfather trying to understand what had gone wrong with a grandson he clearly loved. "Harry has always been the most independent of them," Philip had written. "Perhaps that was inevitable, given what he experienced as a child. But I had hoped that his service in the military would give him the sense of purpose and belonging that seemed to elude him in royal life. I fear we failed him somehow, failed to show him how his unique qualities could serve the institution rather than conflict with it." The words brought tears to Harry's eyes, revealing a depth of understanding and love that he had not realized existed. Philip had not seen Harry's departure as a betrayal or a rejection of family values, but as evidence that the family had somehow failed to provide the support and guidance he needed. The regret in those words mirrored Harry's own feelings about their estrangement. Further entries revealed Philip's thoughts about Meghan, about the challenges she had faced in adapting to royal life, and about the racial undertones that had complicated her acceptance within certain circles. Philip had been more aware of these issues than Harry had realized, and he had struggled with how to address them without seeming to interfere in Charles's role as heir to the throne. "The institution must change," Philip had written. "Not its essential purpose, but its methods, its attitudes, its ability to embrace those who come from different backgrounds and bring new perspectives. If we cannot do this, we will become irrelevant, a museum piece rather than a living institution that serves the people." These insights into his grandfather's thinking were both comforting and heartbreaking. Philip had understood more than he had ever expressed publicly, had recognized the need for change even if he had struggled to implement it during his lifetime. Harry realized that his grandfather's apparent resistance to his decisions had not been based on rigid traditionalism, but on a genuine belief that reform could be achieved from within the system rather than by abandoning it. The next morning brought a surprise visit from Prince William. Harry's brother arrived at Frogmore Cottage unannounced, carrying coffee and pastries from a shop they had both frequented as children. It was a small gesture, but it suggested a willingness to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Their conversation was tentative at first, filled with the careful politeness that had characterized their interactions since Harry's departure. They spoke about the funeral, about their shared memories of Philip, about the strange experience of being together again after so much had changed. But, gradually, the old ease began to return, glimpses of the close relationship they had once shared. William spoke about the pressures he was facing as heir to the throne, about the weight of expectations, and the challenge of modernizing an ancient institution while maintaining its essential character. Harry was struck by how much his brother had matured in their time apart, how the responsibilities of his position had shaped him into someone who could balance tradition with necessary change. For his part, Harry tried to explain his decision to leave, not to justify it, but to help William understand the factors that had driven him away. He spoke about feeling trapped, about the sense that his authentic self was incompatible with the role he was expected to play. William listened without judgment, though though Harry could see that he still struggled to understand how those pressures could outweigh the privilege and opportunity that came with royal life. They talked about their wives, about their children, about the future they were trying to build for the next generation of the royal family. It was clear that both men wanted to find a way forward, to repair the damage that had been done to their relationship, while acknowledging that things could never quite return to the way they had been. "I miss you," William said simply as their conversation drew to a close. "I miss having my brother to talk to share this crazy life with. I understand why you left, even if I don't agree with how you did it. But I hope we can find a way to be brothers again, even if we're living different lives." The words were exactly what Harry needed to hear, an acknowledgement that their relationship mattered more than their disagreements. They hugged goodbye, something they had not done in over a year, and Harry felt a small measure of hope that perhaps the family bonds could be strengthened rather than broken by Philip's death. Harry's final day in England was spent visiting places that held special significance in his relationship with his grandfather. He went to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where Philip had begun his naval career and where he had always felt most comfortable talking about leadership and service. He visited the Duke of Edinburgh Award headquarters, seeing the ongoing work of the program Philip had created to help young people develop confidence and skills. At each location, Harry met people who had been touched by Philip's legacy, young people who had participated in his award program, naval officers who had served under his command, charity workers who had benefited from his support. These conversations helped Harry understand the full scope of his grandfather's impact, the way his dedication to service had rippled out to touch thousands of lives. The stories people shared painted a picture of a man who was demanding but fair, traditional in his methods, but progressive in his goals. Philip had believed in pushing people to exceed their own expectations, in the power of challenge and achievement to build character. He had been particularly passionate about helping young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, understanding that opportunity and encouragement could transform lives. Harry realized that his own charitable work, particularly the Invictus Games for wounded veterans, had been directly inspired by Philip's example. The focus on service, on using privilege to benefit others, on the transformative power of challenge and achievement, all reflected lessons learned from his grandfather. Even in leaving royal life, Harry had taken with him the values Philip had instilled. On his final evening, Harry sat in the gardens of Frogmore Cottage and wrote a letter to his grandfather, a letter that would never be sent but that helped him process his emotions and his regrets. He wrote about their shared memories, about the lessons Philip had taught him, about his gratitude for the love and guidance he had received over the years. He also wrote about his regrets, about the distance that had grown between them in Philip's final months, about the words left unspoken and the reconciliation that would now never come. But, mostly, he wrote about his commitment to honoring Philip's legacy, to finding ways to serve others, and make a positive impact in the world, even if that service would take different forms than Philip might have envisioned. The flight back to California was emotional, but also cathartic. Harry felt like he was carrying something important with him, not just his grandfather's journal and the memories they had shared, but a renewed sense of purpose and connection to his family. Philip's death had been a profound loss, but it had also been an opportunity for reflection and, perhaps, eventual healing. As the plane crossed back over the Atlantic, Harry thought about the future. He knew that his relationship with his family would never be quite the same, that the choices he and Meghan had made had created permanent changes in how they fit into the royal structure. But he also felt hopeful that love could bridge the gaps that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier. Harry thought about Archie, about the stories he would tell his son about his great-grandfather, about the legacy of service and duty that Philip had embodied. He wanted to pass on those values while also allowing his children the freedom to choose their own paths, to serve in their own ways without the constraints that had ultimately driven him away from royal life. The regret would always be there, Harry knew. The knowledge that his final months with Philip had been marked by distance and misunderstanding rather than closeness, and love was a pain that would not easily heal. But alongside that regret was gratitude for the years they had shared, for the lessons learned, and the love given, for the foundation of values that would guide Harry for the rest of his life. Philip was gone, but his influence would continue through his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The institution he had served so faithfully would continue to evolve, hopefully incorporating some of the changes he had recognized as necessary in his private thoughts. And Harry would find his own way to honor that legacy, to serve others, and make a positive impact, carrying forward the best of what his grandfather had taught him while creating his own path in the world. The journey home was also a journey forward, toward a future that would be shaped by the past but not constrained by it. Harry had lost his grandfather, but he had also rediscovered parts of his family that he had thought were gone forever. Philip's death had been an ending, but it might also prove to be a beginning, a chance to rebuild relationships and recommit to the values that truly mattered. The regret would remain, but so would the love, and perhaps, in time, that would be enough. The flight to London felt endless, each hour bringing Harry closer to a reunion he both longed for and dreaded. As the private jet crossed the Atlantic, he found himself replaying conversations from years past, moments with his grandfather that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. The cabin was quiet except for the steady hum of the engines, giving Harry too much time to think, too much space for his regrets to multiply. He had left Meghan and their son Archie in California, a decision that had been difficult but necessary. The tension within the royal family was still too raw, the wounds from the Oprah interview too fresh for Meghan to face the scrutiny that would come with attending the funeral. Harry understood her decision to stay home, but it meant he was making this journey alone, returning to face his family without the support system he had come to depend on. The palace had arranged for him to stay at Frogmore Cottage, the same residence he and Meghan had called home before their departure. The irony was not lost on him that he was returning to the place where they had once been so happy, where they had planned their future as working royals, before everything had fallen apart. Now the cottage would serve as a refuge, a place where he could prepare himself for the emotional marathon that lay ahead. As the plane began its descent into London, Harry thought about the last time he had seen his grandfather in person. It had been during one of his final visits to England, before the relationship between him and the family had completely broken down. Philip had been in his late 90s then, visibly frilier than Harry remembered, but still sharp, still possessed of the wit and intelligence that had defined him throughout his long life. They had sat together in the Duke's study at Windsor Castle, surrounded by the naval memorabilia and family photographs that told the story of Philip's remarkable life. The conversation had been stilted, formal in a way that their interactions had never been before. Harry had wanted to explain his decision to step back from royal duties, to help his grandfather understand why he felt he had no choice but to leave. But the words had not come easily, and Philip had not made it easy for him. "You have responsibilities, Harry," his grandfather had said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent in service to the crown. Responsibilities that don't simply disappear because they become inconvenient. The words had stung because Harry knew they came from a place of genuine belief in duty and service, values that Philip had lived by his entire adult life. Harry had tried to explain about the pressure, about the way the media scrutiny had affected Meghan, about feeling trapped in a system that seemed designed to crush rather than support those within it. But Philip had listened with the expression of someone who had heard excuses before and found them wanting. The man who had given up his own naval career and his personal ambitions to support the Queen could not understand why Harry was not willing to make similar sacrifices. That conversation had ended without resolution, with both men frustrated and disappointed in the other. Harry had left feeling like he had failed to communicate the depth of his struggles, while Philip had clearly felt that his grandson was abandoning his duty for selfish reasons. It was a breach that had never been healed, a misunderstanding that would now never be resolved. The plane touched down at Heathrow, and Harry felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. The media attention would be intense, every gesture analyzed, every expression scrutinized for signs of drama or reconciliation. He had prepared himself for the cameras, for the inevitable questions about his relationship with his family, but he knew that no amount of preparation could truly ready him for the emotional weight of the coming days. The journey to Frogmore Cottage was surreal, passing through landscapes that were achingly familiar yet somehow foreign after his time in California. The English countryside looked exactly as he remembered it, green and rolling and peaceful. But Harry felt like a visitor in his own homeland. The security protocols, the careful coordination of his movements, the way palace staff addressed him with formal politeness rather than warmth, all served to remind him how much had changed. Frogmore Cottage was exactly as they had left it, but walking through rooms that had once been filled with laughter and hope was more difficult than Harry had anticipated. This was where he and Meghan had planned their new life together, where they had dreamed of raising their family while serving the crown. The nursery they had prepared for Archie was still there, a painful reminder of the future they had imagined but could never quite make work. Harry's first official meeting was with palace staff to discuss the funeral arrangements. The conversation was professional, efficient, designed to ensure that everything would proceed smoothly despite the underlying family tensions. But what struck Harry most was how carefully everyone spoke around the obvious issues, the way conversations were structured to avoid any mention of the conflicts that had dominated the headlines for months. The funeral would be small by royal standards, limited by coronavirus restrictions to just 30 guests. This meant that every decision about who would attend and where they would sit carried additional weight. Harry learned that he would not walk beside his brother William in the funeral procession, a decision that spoke volumes about how damaged their relationship had become. Instead, their cousin Peter Phillips would walk between them, a physical buffer that would prevent any awkward interactions. These details should have seemed trivial in the face of their shared grief, but Harry understood their significance. Every element of the funeral would be watched and analyzed, interpreted as evidence of either reconciliation or continued division within the family. The palace was clearly determined to present an image of dignity and unity, even if the reality was far more complicated. That evening, Harry sat alone in the cottage and tried to call his father. The conversation was brief, formal, focused entirely on the practical arrangements for the funeral. Charles's voice was tired, strained with grief, but there was also a distance there that Harry had not heard before their falling out. They spoke about logistics, about timing, about protocol, but not about Philip himself, not about their shared memories or their mutual loss. After the call ended, Harry felt more isolated than ever. He was surrounded by people who had once been close to him, who had shared experiences and memories spanning decades, but the connections that had once bound them together seemed to have been severed. The family that had rallied around him during his darkest moments, after his mother's death and during his struggles with mental health, now felt like strangers. Harry spent the next day walking through Windsor, visiting places that held special memories of his grandfather. He went to the Royal Mews, where Philip had kept his carriage horses and where Harry had learned to handle the animals as a young boy. He visited the polo grounds where they had played together, where Philip had taught him the finer points of the game with characteristic bluntness and humor. Each location brought fresh waves of memory and regret. Harry remembered being 16 and playing polo badly, frustrated with his performance and ready to give up. Philip had taken him aside and told him about his own struggles with the game, about the years it had taken him to develop any real skill. Persistence, Harry, he had said. Talent is useful, but persistence is essential. The advice had applied to far more than polo, and Harry had carried it with him through his military service and his charitable work. Now, walking alone through these familiar spaces, Harry wished he had shown more persistence in maintaining his relationship with his grandfather. He had allowed pride and hurt feelings to create distance between them, had convinced himself that there would always be time later to repair the damage. The reality of Philip's mortality had somehow never seemed real, despite his advancing age and declining health. The evening before the funeral, Harry received an unexpected visitor. His cousin Zara Tyndall, Philip's granddaughter and one of the family members with whom Harry had always felt closest, came to Frogmore Cottage. She brought with her a bottle of whiskey and a collection of photographs from various family gatherings over the years. For the first time since his return to England, Harry felt something approaching normalcy. Zara had always been able to cut through the formality and protocol that surrounded royal life, had never treated Harry as anything other than her cousin and friend. She understood the unique pressures of growing up in the royal family, while also maintaining a degree of independence that Harry envied. They spent hours looking through the photographs, sharing memories and stories about Philip. Zara talked about her grandfather's pride in Harry's military service, about how he had bragged to anyone who would listen about Harry's tours of duty in Afghanistan. She reminded Harry of the Duke's reaction when Harry had established the Invictus Games for wounded veterans, how Philip had seen it as a perfect example of using royal privilege to serve a worthy cause. "He never understood why you left," Zara said gently. "But he never stopped loving you. He was hurt, Harry, but not angry. He was worried about you, about whether you were making the right decision for yourself and your family." Her words brought tears to Harry's eyes, the first he had shed since receiving the news of Philip's death. Zara also shared more difficult truths. She told Harry about the Oprah interview, about how Philip had watched parts of it, and struggled to understand Harry's public criticism of the family. The Duke had been particularly hurt by the implications of racism within the royal household, not because he denied that such attitudes existed, but because he had worked so hard throughout his life to modernize the institution and make it more inclusive. "He felt like you were painting all of us with the same brush," Zara explained. "He understood that you and Meghan had faced real challenges, real problems, but he couldn't understand why you chose to air those problems publicly rather than working to fix them from within." The conversation was painful but necessary, giving Harry insight into his grandfather's perspective that he had never fully considered. They talked late into the night, and for those few hours, Harry felt reconnected to his family in a way he had not experienced since his departure. Zara did not judge him for his decisions, did not try to convince him that he had been wrong, but she helped him understand the impact those decisions had had on people he loved. It was exactly the kind of honest, caring conversation that Harry had been missing, the kind of family connection that he had sacrificed when he chose to leave royal life behind. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and drizzly, typical English weather that seemed appropriate for such a solemn occasion. Harry dressed carefully in his military uniform, the same uniform he had worn with such pride during his years of active service. The medals and decorations felt heavy on his chest, reminders of the life he had built in service to his country and his family. The journey to Windsor Castle was made in silence, Harry lost in his own thoughts as the countryside passed by the car windows. He thought about all the times he had made this same journey as a child, excited to visit his grandparents, eager to escape the formality of palace life for the relative warmth and comfort of Windsor. Those had been some of the happiest times of his childhood, moments when he could simply be a grandson rather than a prince. Arriving at the castle, Harry felt the weight of history and tradition pressing down on him. This was where his grandfather had lived and worked for decades, where he had supported the Queen through the countless challenges and changes of her long reign. The stone walls held within them the echoes of family gatherings, state occasions, private moments of joy and sorrow that stretched back through generations of royal history. Harry took his place in the funeral procession, walking behind the specially modified Land Rover that would carry Philip's coffin. The vehicle had been designed by the Duke himself, a practical, no-nonsense approach to his final journey that was entirely typical of the man. Even in death, Philip had insisted on doing things his own way, rejecting the pomp and ceremony that he had tolerated but never embraced during his lifetime. As they walked through the grounds of Windsor Castle, Harry caught sight of his brother William for the first time since his return to England. The physical resemblance between them was still striking, but there was a coldness in William's expression that Harry had never seen before. They had been each other's closest confidant for most of their lives, united by their shared loss of their mother and their unique understanding of the pressures they faced as senior royals. Now they were strangers, separated by choices and words that seemed impossible to take back. The funeral service itself was beautiful and dignified, exactly what Philip would have wanted. The music, the readings, the military honors all reflected his life of service and duty. But, for Harry, the most powerful moment came not during the formal ceremony, but in the quiet moments afterward, when the family gathered privately to share their memories and their grief. Standing beside Philip's coffin, Harry finally allowed himself to fully experience the magnitude of his loss. This was not just the death of his grandfather, but the end of an era, the loss of the last direct connection to the royal family of his childhood. Philip had been the bridge between the old ways and the new, the man who had helped modernize the monarchy while maintaining its essential character and purpose. As the day wore on and the formal ceremonies concluded, Harry found himself face to face with his father and brother for the first time in over a year. The conversation was awkward, stilted, full of the careful politeness that had replaced the easy familiarity they had once shared. They spoke about Philip, about their shared memories, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Harry realized that his grandfather's death had not magically healed the wounds within the family. If anything, it had highlighted how far apart they had grown, how much damage had been done to relationships that had once seemed unbreakable. The funeral had brought them together physically, but the emotional distance remained as vast as ever. As evening fell, and the day of mourning drew to a close, Harry returned to Frogmore Cottage alone. The cottage felt emptier than ever, filled with the ghosts of happier times and lost possibilities. He sat in the garden where he and Meghan had once planned their future, where they had dreamed of raising their children while serving the crown, and he felt the full weight of all that had been lost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Frogmore Cottage as Prince Harry sat alone in his study, staring at the phone that had delivered the news he had been dreading. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had passed away peacefully at Windsor Castle. The date was April 9th, 2021, and Harry felt the weight of an ocean between him and his family like never before. In the quiet of his Montecito home, thousands of miles from the royal family he had left behind, Harry found himself overwhelmed by emotions he had not expected. The grief was immediate and crushing, but it was the regret that cut deepest. He thought about the last time he had spoken to his grandfather, a brief phone call months earlier that had been formal and distant. There had been no warmth in that conversation, no laughter, none of the easy banter that had once defined their relationship. Harry remembered being a young boy, following his grandfather around the royal estates. Philip had always been different from the other adults in his life. Where others spoke in careful, measured tones about duty and protocol, Philip was direct, sometimes blunt, but always honest. He had a way of cutting through the formality that surrounded royal life and speaking to Harry as simply a grandfather to his grandson. Those early memories flooded back now with painful clarity. Philip teaching him to drive on the private roads at Balmoral, his grandfather's hands steady on the wheel as he guided a nervous teenage Harry through the basics. Philip had been patient then, something that surprised many people who knew only his public reputation for sharp comments and no-nonsense attitudes. But with his grandchildren, especially Harry, there had always been a softer side. The Duke had understood Harry in ways that others in the family sometimes struggled to. When Harry had acted out as a teenager, getting into trouble at school, or making headlines for the wrong reasons, Philip had not lectured him. Instead, he had taken Harry aside and shared stories from his own youth, tales of rebellion and mistakes that had shaped him into the man he became. Those conversations had meant everything to Harry, moments of connection with someone who understood what it meant to feel like an outsider, even within the royal family. Philip had come to the royal family as an outsider himself, a Greek prince without a country, who had to give up his titles and his naval career to marry the future queen. He had faced his own struggles with protocol and finding his place within the ancient institution of the monarchy. Perhaps that was why he had always seemed to understand Harry's restlessness, his desire to forge his own path. Now, sitting in his California home, Harry realized how much he had lost when he and Meghan made the decision to step back from royal duties. The decision had not been easy, and it had created rifts in the family that seemed impossible to bridge. His relationship with his father, Prince Charles, had become strained almost to the breaking point. His once close bond with his brother William had deteriorated into something cold and formal. But it was the distance from Philip that hurt most of all. Harry had always assumed there would be time to repair those relationships. Philip was strong, seemingly indestructible despite his age. He had survived a naval career during World War II, decades of royal duties, and numerous health scares. The idea that he might not be there when Harry was ready to rebuild those bridges had never seemed real. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was a palace aide, calling to discuss arrangements for his return to England for the funeral. The conversation was professional, courteous, but lacking any warmth. Harry found himself wondering if this was how it would always be now, formal interactions with people who had once been close to him. As he hung up the phone, Harry's mind drifted to the interview he and Meghan had given to Oprah Winfrey just a month earlier. They had spoken openly about their struggles within the royal family, about feeling unsupported and, in Meghan's case, unwelcome. The interview had created a media storm and had further damaged relationships within the family. Harry wondered now if Philip had watched it, what he had thought about his grandson's public criticisms of the institution he had served faithfully for over 70 years. The regret was like a physical weight in Harry's chest. He thought about all the conversations he should have had with his grandfather, all the times he should have called just to check in. Philip had always been interested in Harry's military career, proud of his service in Afghanistan. They had shared that connection, two men who understood the bonds formed in military service, the sense of purpose that came from serving something greater than yourself. Harry remembered the day he had told his grandparents about his decision to leave royal duties. The Queen had been gracious, but clearly disappointed. Philip had said little during that conversation, but Harry could see the hurt in his eyes. His grandfather had spent his entire adult life in service to the crown, had given up his own ambitions and desires to support the Queen and the institution of the monarchy. The idea that Harry would walk away from that duty, that privilege, was something Philip struggled to understand. But even in that difficult conversation, Philip had not been harsh or critical. He had listened, asked a few pointed questions, and then given Harry his blessing to do what he felt was right for his family. It was typical of his grandfather, Harry thought now. Philip might not agree with the decision, but he would support Harry's right to make it. The memories kept coming, each one more painful than the last. Harry thought about the Christmas mornings at Sandringham, where Philip had always been the one to organize the traditional Boxing Day shoot. He had taught Harry to handle firearms safely, to respect the countryside and the traditions that came with it. Those had been special times, moments when Harry felt connected not just to his grandfather, but to generations of his family who had walked those same paths. He remembered Philip's dry sense of humor, the way he could defuse tension with a perfectly timed joke or observation. The Duke had never taken himself too seriously, despite his position, and he had tried to teach that lesson to his grandchildren. Don't believe your own publicity, he had once told Harry after a particularly glowing newspaper article about the young prince's charity work. Good headlines today, bad headlines tomorrow. What matters is the work, not what people say about it. That advice seemed particularly relevant now, as Harry faced the reality of how his relationship with the British media and the public had changed since his move to America. The decision to speak out about his experiences within the royal family had been necessary, he believed, but it had come at a cost. He wondered if Philip would have understood that choice, or if he would have counseled patience and quiet service instead. Harry's phone buzzed with a text message from his brother William. It was brief, formal, simply confirming details about the funeral arrangements. There was no personal warmth in the message, no acknowledgement of their shared grief. That hurt almost as much as Philip's death itself. Harry had lost not just his grandfather, but it seemed he had lost his brother too. He thought about how Philip would have reacted to this estrangement between his grandsons. The Duke had always been proud of the close relationship between William and Harry, had often spoken about how important it was for them to support each other. He had lived through his own family divisions, had seen how destructive they could be, and had always encouraged unity among his children and grandchildren. The irony was not lost on Harry that Philip's death might be the thing that brought the family together, at least temporarily. The funeral would require them all to set aside their differences, to present a united front during a time of mourning. But Harry wondered what would happen after the cameras were gone, after the formal period of grief was over. Would they be able to rebuild what had been broken, or would they return to their separate lives and the silence that had defined their relationships over the past year? As the day wore on, Harry found himself scrolling through old photographs on his phone, images from happier times when the family had been together. There were pictures from royal events, formal portraits where everyone looked perfect and composed. But the ones that moved him most were the candid shots, moments captured when no one was thinking about protocol or public image. One photo in particular caught his attention. It was from a summer at Balmoral, probably 5 or 6 years earlier. Philip was standing beside a barbecue, wearing casual clothes and a chef's apron, laughing at something Harry had just said. William was in the background, also laughing, while other family members milled around the garden. It had been a perfect afternoon, the kind of day when the weight of royal duty seemed to lift, and they could just be a family. Harry stared at that photo for a long time, remembering how natural and easy everything had felt that day. Philip had been in his element, cooking for his family, telling stories, making everyone laugh. There had been no tension, no underlying conflicts, just the simple pleasure of being together. Harry would give anything to have one more day like that, one more chance to see his grandfather smile and hear his voice. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. There would be no more phone calls from Philip, no more letters written in his distinctive handwriting, no more opportunities to seek his advice or simply chat about life. The man who had been a constant presence in Harry's life for over 30 years was gone, and with him went a connection to his family and his past that could never be replaced. Harry knew he would have to be strong in the coming days. The funeral would be difficult, facing his family for the first time since the Oprah interview, dealing with the media attention and public scrutiny. But, for now, in the quiet of his study, he allowed himself to grieve not just for his grandfather, but for the relationship they should have had in these final months, for the words that would never be spoken, for the forgiveness that might never come. The sun was setting over Montecito, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Harry thought about how Philip would have appreciated the beauty of that sunset, would have made some observation about the weather or the light. His grandfather had always been attuned to the natural world, had found peace in the landscapes of Scotland and the countryside of England. Tomorrow would bring the practical realities of planning his return to England, of coordinating with palace officials, of preparing for a funeral that would be watched by millions around the world. But tonight, Harry simply sat with his memories and his regrets, mourning not just a grandfather, but a relationship that had been one of the most important in his life. As darkness fell, Harry finally stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the stars that were beginning to appear in the clear California sky. Somewhere across that ocean, his family was dealing with their own grief, their own preparations for saying goodbye to the patriarch who had held them together for so long. Harry felt the distance between them like a physical ache, knowing that even in this moment of shared sorrow, they were facing it apart rather than together. He thought about calling his father or his brother, reaching out to share memories of Philip and perhaps begin to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But he hesitated, uncertain of what kind of reception he would receive, afraid that even their shared grief might not be enough to overcome the hurt and anger that had built up over the past year. Instead, Harry picked up his phone and began typing a message to his grandmother, the Queen. He wanted her to know that despite everything that had happened, despite the distance and the disagreements, his love for the family remained unchanged. He wanted her to know that he was thinking of her in her grief, that he understood what Philip had meant to her and to all of them. The message was simple, heartfelt, free of the politics and complications that had dominated their recent interactions. It was just a grandson reaching out to his grandmother in a moment of loss, expressing love and support across the miles that separated them. As he sent the message, Harry felt a small measure of peace, a sense that maybe, in time, the wounds could heal and the family could find their way back to each other. But, for now, he was alone with his regrets, with the weight of words unspoken and opportunities lost. Prince Philip was gone, and with him went a piece of Harry's past that could never be recovered. All he could do now was honor his grandfather's memory and hope that somehow the love that had once bound their family together might prove stronger than the forces that had driven them apart.